Hunting was something I'd done my whole life, taught by my father and his father before him. There was a sense of peace that came from being out there, just me and the wilderness, with nothing but the sounds of nature around me. That day, though, something was different. I could feel it in the air. I should have taken it as a sign to turn back, but curiosity and the thrill of the hunt pushed me forward. I'd been tracking a large buck for hours, following its tracks through the dense forest. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, making it harder to see. I knew I needed to make my move soon if I wanted to go home with anything that day. As I crept through the woods, I caught sight of something moving in the distance. It was much bigger than the buck I'd been tracking. My heart began to race as I crouched down, raising my rifle and peering through the scope. Whatever it was tall and covered in dark fur. It moved on all fours, but there was something unnatural about the way it moved, almost like it was too large and heavy for its limbs. I thought it was a bear, maybe even a wolf, though I'd never seen one that big in these parts. My finger tightened on the trigger as I waited for a clear shot. It revealed its face for the first time. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen. The face was almost human, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to lock onto mine through the scope. Fear surged through me, my instincts screaming at me to run, but my body was frozen in place. The creature let out a low growl, and that was all it took. I squeezed the trigger, the rifle kicking back against my shoulder as the shot rang out through the silent forest. The creature let out a howl of pain, standing up on its hind legs, towering over the underbrush. It clutched at its side where the bullet had struck, its eyes flashing with something that looked almost like anger. For a moment, our eyes met again, and I could see the intelligence there, the understanding. This wasn't just some wild animal. Before I could react, the creature turned and bolted into the trees, moving faster than anything that size had a right to. I scrambled to my feet and chased after it. I wasn't thinking clearly, just running on pure adrenaline, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. What was that thing? How had I never seen it before? And how could it move so fast after being shot? I followed the trail of blood through the forest, my rifle at the ready, but as the minutes passed, the trail grew fainter. The sun had set completely by now, leaving me in near total darkness, the only light coming from the pale sliver of the moon overhead. The further I went, the more I felt like I was being watched, like something was stalking me from the shadows. But every time I turned around, there was nothing there, just the trees swaying in the wind. Eventually, the blood trail disappeared completely, and I was left standing alone in the woods, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I turned in a slow circle, trying to catch any sign of movement, but the forest was silent again, as if nothing had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, watching me, waiting. After what felt like hours, I finally gave up and started making my way back to the cabin. I couldn't get the image of the creature's face out of my head, those intelligent eyes staring at me through the scope. I tried to rationalize it, tell myself that it was just some wild animal, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. I barely slept that night, my mind replaying the events over and over. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature standing over me. When the morning finally came, I packed up my gear and left the woods, my heart heavy with the weight of what I had done. For days after, I scoured the forest, searching for any sign of the creature, but there was nothing. No tracks, no blood, no sign that it had ever been there at all. It was as if the forest had swallowed it whole, erasing all evidence of its existence. I talked to other hunters in the area, asking if they had seen anything unusual, but no one had. They just looked at me like I was crazy when I tried to describe what I had seen. It was an early morning when we decided to go for a hike. The sun was just beginning to rise. The air was crisp and fresh, and everything seemed peaceful. We had been hiking for about an hour, enjoying the quiet of the woods and the sounds of birds chirping. The path we were on was narrow and winding, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to reach up into the sky. Every so often, a ray of sunlight would break through the canopy, lighting up patches of the forest floor. It was one of those perfect mornings when everything felt right with the world. But then, something happened that changed everything. As we rounded a bend in the trail, we both noticed something unusual out of the corner of our eyes. There, just off the path, standing partially behind a large tree, was a figure. At first I thought it might be a trick of the light or maybe just a large bear. But as I looked closer, I realized this was no bear. The figure was tall and furry, its outline barely visible against the shadows of the trees. It stood still, almost as if it were watching us. There was something about the way it stood, something almost human, but not quite. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. We both stopped in our tracks, our eyes locked on the figure. It was hard to tell exactly what it was because it stayed mostly hidden behind the tree. I remember my heart pounding in my chest, a mixture of fear and curiosity taking over. What was it? Could it be? The thought that it might be Bigfoot crossed my mind, but it seemed so unbelievable. The figure remained still for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a few seconds. I tried to make out more details, but the shadows made it difficult. All I could see was the large, dark shape of something that didn't quite belong. I felt frozen, unable to move, my mind racing with questions and doubts. Then, the figure seemed to vanish. It didn't run or make any sudden movements. It was just gone. One moment it was there, and the next, it wasn't. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Had it really been there? Or was my mind playing tricks on me? We stood there for a moment longer, staring at the spot where the figure had been. I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief that it was gone, but also a deep sense of wonder. What had we just witnessed? We continued our hike, but the mood had changed. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful just a little while ago, now felt different. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure again. But it never reappeared. I wanted to believe that it was just a shadow, something easily explained. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had seen something extraordinary, something that most people only hear about in stories. The idea of Bigfoot has always fascinated me, but I never thought I would be one of the people who might have actually seen it. We didn't talk much for the rest of the hike. There wasn't much to say. What could we say? We both knew what we had seen, or at least what we thought we had seen, but how could we explain it? It was as if the forest had shown us a glimpse of a secret, something it usually keeps hidden from the world. When we finally made it back to the car, I felt a strange sense of loss. The mystery of what we had seen lingered in my mind, a question that would never truly be answered. I knew that no matter how many times I went over it, I would never be sure of what I had seen that morning. It would remain a mystery, a story to tell, but never fully understand. As we drove away, the forest seemed to close in behind us, as if it were swallowing up the secret once again. The trees stood tall and silent, guarding whatever it was that they had shown us. I couldn't help but feel that we had been given a rare glimpse into something ancient and unknown, something that would always remain just out of reach. I was sitting on a bench in the middle of the mall, enjoying my coffee, when something strange caught my eye. It wasn't anything I could easily explain, just a feeling, like a shadow passing over me, even though I was sitting under bright lights. I looked around, and that's when I saw it. There was a man, or at least, it looked like a man at first. He was wandering around the mall, moving from one store to another, but something about him was off. I couldn't put my finger on it right away. He wore a long coat, which was strange because it wasn't cold outside. It was the middle of summer, and everyone else was in shorts and t-shirts. But this guy had on a coat that reached down to his ankles. I watched him for a while, trying to figure out what was bothering me. Maybe it was the way he walked. His movements were too smooth, almost like he was gliding across the floor. Most people have a little bounce in their step, but not this guy. He moved like he was on a mission, but he didn't seem to know where he was going. He kept looking around, his eyes darting back and forth, but he never seemed to focus on anything for too long. As I watched him, I noticed something else. His skin didn't look right. It was too smooth, too shiny, almost like plastic. But then, when he turned his head just right, I saw it. Underneath the bright lights of the mall, his skin seemed to shimmer like there were scales underneath. I blinked, thinking I was imagining things, but when I looked again, I saw the same thing. His skin wasn't normal. It was like the skin of a reptile. My heart started to race. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I knew it wasn't human. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that I could be wrong. But the more I watched him, the more convinced I became. This wasn't a person. This was something else entirely. He kept moving around the mall, stopping in front of stores but never going in. He would stand there for a moment, staring through the glass, and then move on. It was as if he was looking for something, but he couldn't find it. People walked by him, not paying him any attention, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. As I sat there, watching, I noticed another man. This one was different. He was sitting a few benches away from me, and he was watching the Reptilian too. He was trying to be discreet, hiding behind a newspaper, but I could see him peeking over the top. He looked nervous, his hands trembling slightly as he held the paper. It was clear he knew something was wrong too. The Reptilian moved closer to the center of the mall, where the big fountain was. I could see the man with the newspaper tense up as the Reptilian got closer. He put the paper down and leaned forward, like he was ready to jump up at any moment. I could see the sweat on his forehead, even from where I was sitting. The Reptilian stopped by the fountain and looked around again. For a moment, it seemed like it was about to do something, but then it just stood there, as if waiting. I glanced back at the man with the newspaper. He was slowly reaching into his coat pocket, his eyes never leaving the Reptilian. I didn't know what he was planning, but I could tell he was ready to act. The mall was busy, with people walking around, laughing and talking, but it felt like time had slowed down, like everything was happening in slow motion. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could barely breathe. I knew something was about to happen, but I didn't know what. Then suddenly, the Reptilian turned its head and looked directly at the man with the newspaper. Its eyes, which I hadn't noticed before, were a bright yellow, with slits for pupils, just like a snake's. The man froze, his hand still in his pocket. For a moment, they just stared at each other, and I could feel the tension in the air. The Reptilian took a step forward, and the man jumped up from the bench. He pulled something out of his pocket, but before I could see what it was, the Reptilian moved. It was so fast, faster than anything I'd ever seen. One moment it was standing by the fountain, and the next it was gone, disappearing into the crowd. The man with the newspaper ran after it, shoving people out of the way as he went. I lost sight of both of them in the crowd. My heart was still racing, and I felt like I was in a daze. I didn't know what I had just witnessed, but I knew it wasn't normal. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, and the man with the newspaper knew it too. I stayed on the bench for a long time after that, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The mall continued on as if nothing had happened, with people shopping and kids playing by the fountain. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had just occurred. something beyond my understanding. Eventually, I got up and left the mall, my coffee long forgotten. As I walked out into the bright sunlight, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the reptilian or the man with the newspaper following me. But there was nothing, just the usual hustle and bustle of a busy summer day. My journey to Indonesia was meant to be a simple adventure. I had planned to spend a few weeks at a friend's farm in Sumatra, far away from the busy city life I was used to. The idea of living close to nature, surrounded by thick forests and mountains, was more appealing than anything I could think of. Little did I know that this trip would lead me to an encounter with something that would change the way I saw the world forever. The farm was nestled on the edge of a dense jungle. It was a place of peace, where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional call of exotic birds. My friend had told me stories about the local wildlife, but nothing prepared me for what I was about to experience. One evening, after a long day of helping out on the farm, I decided to take a walk. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the landscape. I followed a narrow path that led into the jungle, curious to see more of the land. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers, and I felt a sense of excitement as I ventured deeper into the unknown. The path became more overgrown as I walked. The light began to fade, and soon I found myself in near darkness. I thought about turning back, but something compelled me to keep going. There was a strange energy in the air, something that I couldn't quite explain. As I pushed through a thicket of bushes, I suddenly caught sight of something unusual. At first, I thought it was a small animal, maybe a monkey, moving quickly through the underbrush. But as I looked closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It stood on two legs, about 3 feet tall, with a body covered in thick, dark hair. Its arms were long and powerful, and its movements were surprisingly graceful for something that seemed so wild. I froze, not wanting to startle the creature. It didn't seem to notice me at first, moving through the forest with a sense of purpose. But then it stopped, turning its head slowly in my direction. For a moment, our eyes met. There was something intelligent, almost human, in its gaze. I stood there, unable to move, as the creature watched me. It was as if time had stopped, and we were both suspended in that moment. I knew I was looking at something extraordinary, something that few people had ever seen. The stories of the orang pendek, the short person of the jungle, came rushing back to me. I had heard tales of this elusive cryptid, but I had never truly believed it existed. Yet here it was, standing right in front of me. The creature made a soft, almost musical sound. I stood there trying to process what I had just witnessed. My heart was racing, and my mind was spinning with questions. Was it really the orang pendek? Had I just seen one of the most mysterious creatures on the planet? I slowly made my way back to the farm, my thoughts consumed by the encounter. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen at first. It felt too strange, too unbelievable. I spent the next few days exploring the jungle, hoping to catch another glimpse of the creature, but it was as if it had vanished into thin air. The jungle was full of life, but the mystical being remained hidden. As I continued my stay on the farm, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been given a rare glimpse into a world that few people knew existed. The experience made me question everything I thought I knew about nature and the creatures that inhabit it. If the orang pendek was real, what else could be out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be discovered? My encounter with the orang pendek became a part of me, something that I carried with me long after I left Indonesia. I never stopped thinking about it, and I found myself drawn to the idea of exploring other wild places, seeking out the unknown. The world was full of wonders, and I wanted to see them all. Years later, I still find myself returning to that moment in the jungle, standing face to face with a creature that shouldn't exist. It was a reminder that the world is bigger and more mysterious than we can ever imagine. The sun was casting an orange glow across the calm ocean. The beach was quiet now, the earlier crowds having dwindled down to just a few people. Most had packed up their towels and chairs, ready to head home after a long day under the sun. The warmth from the sand beneath my feet was fading, and the air was beginning to cool as evening set in. The ocean's waves gently lapped at the shore, creating a peaceful rhythm. I was standing near the edge of the water, taking in the last moments of daylight. The beach had always been a place of solace for me, a place where I could forget about the worries of the world and just be present in the moment. The sound of the waves, the smell of the salty air, and the feeling of the sand between my toes always made me feel at peace. It was my favorite time of day, the time when the world seemed to slow down and everything felt just a little bit more magical. As I stood there, something caught my eye in the water a few feet away. At first, I thought it was just a piece of driftwood or maybe some seaweed that had washed ashore. But as I looked closer, I realized it was something much larger. It was moving, struggling against something unseen. My heart began to race as I squinted into the dimming light, trying to make out what it was. The shape in the water was long and sleek, with what looked like tentacles writhing around it. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It looked like a giant squid, something I had only ever heard about in stories or seen in documentaries. But this was real, and it was right in front of me, just a few feet away from the shore. The squid was trapped in a net, its tentacles tangled in the thick ropes. It was struggling to free itself, its body twisting and turning in the water as it tried to escape. The sight of the creature filled me with a mix of awe and fear. I had never seen anything like it before. Its body was massive, at least 15 feet long, with dark, smooth skin that glistened in the fading light. Its tentacles were long and powerful, each one covered in suction cups that seemed to grip the net tightly. I wasn't sure what to do. The squid was clearly in distress, and I felt a pang of sympathy for the creature. It was struggling so hard to free itself, its movements growing more frantic as the seconds passed. I could see the strength in its tentacles as they thrashed in the water, trying to tear through the net. It was a battle of life and death, and I was witnessing it unfold right before my eyes. The ocean's waves continued to lap at the shore, pushing the squid closer and closer to the beach. I could see the desperation in its movements, the way it twisted and turned, trying to find a way out of the trap. It was so close to freedom, yet so far. I wanted to help, but I knew there was nothing I could do. The net was thick and strong, and the squid was too large for me to even think about trying to free it myself. All I could do was watch, hoping that the creature would find a way to escape. The squid's movements became more frenzied as the net seemed to tighten around it. For a moment, I feared that it might not make it, that the net would be too strong, and the squid would be trapped forever. But then, something changed. The squid's movements slowed, and it seemed to gather its strength. With one final, powerful twist, it managed to free one of its tentacles from the net, then another, and another. Slowly but surely, the squid was freeing itself, untangling its tentacles one by one. It was an incredible sight to behold, watching this magnificent creature fight for its freedom with such determination. Finally, the last of the tentacles slipped free from the net. The squid paused for a moment, as if catching its breath, before it began to move away from the shore. Its long body glided through the water, its tentacles trailing behind it like ribbons. I watched in awe as it swam out into the deeper waters, its movements graceful and fluid. As the squid disappeared into the darkening ocean, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. It had made it. It was free. The net that had once held it captive was now just a lifeless tangle of ropes floating in the water. The squid had won its battle, and it was now back where it belonged, in the vast, open sea. The ocean was calm once again, as if nothing had happened. But I knew that I had just witnessed something extraordinary, something that I would never forget. As I walked back up the beach, the events of the evening replayed in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about the giant squid and its incredible fight for freedom. That night, as I lay in bed, I could still see the image of the giant squid in my mind. And I had been lucky enough to witness one of those secrets just before the sun went down.